In the autumn of 1927, beneath the flickering gaslights of a traveling circus in Roanoke, Virginia, two men took the stage, their hair bleached white as cotton and twisted into grotesque locks, caught the amber glow as they began to strum their instruments. The crowd pressed closer, coins clutched in eager fists, drawn by the promise of spectacle, of seeing something that shouldn't exist. The banner above them proclaimed Echo and Eco, ambassadors from Mars, beings so alien, so removed from humanity, that audiences could gawk without guilt. But as the haunting melody of It's a Long Way to Tipperary filled the tent, one of the performers suddenly stopped mid-note. His eyes, squinting against lights that had tortured them for decades, had found something impossible in the crowd. "There's our dear old mother," he whispered to his brother. "Look, Willie, she is not dead. Welcome back to the Litany of the Lost, where we uncover the stories that history tried to forget. I'm your host, and today we journey into one of America's most heartbreaking tales of exploitation, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family love. This is the story of George and Willie Muse, two brothers who vanished from a Virginia tobacco farm as children and reappeared decades later as the most famous freaks in America. Their story begins in the shadows of the Jim Crow South, in a place called Truevine, where the impossible happened not once but twice. It's a tale that journalists called ungettable for nearly a century. Too painful, too complex, too wrapped in shame and secrecy for anyone to fully unravel. Until now, what you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about entertainment, exploitation, and the price of being different in America. It's a story of two young boys who were transformed into living myths, told they were monsters from another world, and forced to perform their own dehumanization night after night, before crowds who saw them as everything except what they truly were: human beings with names, families, and hearts that never stopped hoping for home. But this is also the story of Harriet Muse, a sharecropper's widow who refused to believe her sons were gone forever. In an era when black women had no legal standing, when disabled people were considered property, when the powerful could steal children and call it business, she fought an entire industry and won. For 28 years, this story remained buried in the shadows of American history, hidden, like so many uncomfortable truths, beneath layers of myth and deliberate forgetting. The circus presented it as fantasy. The South preferred to ignore it. Even well-meaning historians struggled to separate fact from the elaborate fiction that had been built around two vulnerable children. But every story in the Litany of the Lost deserves to be told, especially those that illuminate the darkest corners of our past. Because in George and Willie Muse, we find not just victims of a cruel system, but survivors who maintained their humanity when the world insisted they had none. We find not just exploitation, but the triumph of love over an industry built on human suffering. So settle in, as we travel back to the early 1900s, to a small community on the edge of Roanoke, Virginia, where two extraordinary children were born into a world that would see their differences not as gifts to cherish, but as commodities to exploit. This is their story, raw, heartbreaking, and ultimately redemptive. This is the story that America tried to forget, the story of the boys who became Mars ambassadors and the mother who brought them home. The year was 1890, and in the rolling hills of southwestern Virginia, a small community called Truevine existed on the margins of the American South. It was a place where freed slaves and their descendants eked out a living from the red clay soil, sharecropping tobacco for white landowners who controlled every aspect of their economic lives. Here in a weathered wooden cabin, Harriet Muse gave birth to her first son, George. 3 years later, in 1893, came Willie. And with Willie's birth, the impossible became reality. Both boys were born with oculocutaneous albinism, a rare genetic condition that strips the body of melanin, the pigment that gives color to skin, hair, and eyes. In a family of dark-skinned African Americans, George and Willie emerged into the world with skin as pale as moonlight and hair the color of spun gold. Their eyes, a startling blue-gray, moved constantly in involuntary jerks, a condition called nystagmus that often accompanies albinism. To understand the magnitude of this genetic anomaly, consider the odds. Oculocutaneous albinism affects roughly 1 in 17,000 people worldwide. For two siblings to both be born with the condition, the chances are astronomical, perhaps 1 in several hundred million. The Muse brothers were not just rare. They were a genetic miracle wrapped in what the world would see as a curse. Harriet Muse was a woman of deep faith and fierce determination. Standing barely 5 feet tall, she possessed an inner strength that would become legendary in the Truevine community. She had married young, as was common for women of her generation and circumstances, but her husband was largely absent from the family's daily struggles. It fell to Harriet to raise her extraordinary children in a world that had no place for them. The Virginia of the 1890s was a hostile environment for any African American, but for two albino boys it was particularly treacherous. The Jim Crow laws had crystallized the South's commitment to white supremacy, creating a rigid caste system that relegated black Americans to second-class citizenship. Violence was a constant threat. Between 1882 and 1968, Virginia would witness 86 documented lynchings, with the actual number likely much higher. Black children learned early to keep their heads down, to make themselves invisible, to survive, but George and Willie could never be invisible. Their condition made them spectacles wherever they went. Their skin, completely defenseless against the Virginia sun, burned easily and severely. Their eyes, lacking protective pigment, watered constantly in bright light, forcing them to squint perpetually. By the time they were school-age, deep furrows had etched themselves across their foreheads from a lifetime of shielding their eyes against a world too bright to bear. The boys found solace in each other. George, the elder by 3 years, appointed himself Willie's protector. He guided his younger brother through the tobacco rows where they worked alongside their mother, killing the hornworms that could destroy an entire crop. In the evenings, they would sit together on the cabin's front porch, listening to the sounds of rural Virginia, the night birds calling, the distant laughter from neighboring cabins, the whisper of wind through tobacco leaves. It was during these quiet moments that the boys discovered their gift. Someone in the community owned a battered old banjo, and when George first picked it up, his fingers seemed to find the strings by instinct. Willie watched his brother intently, memorizing every movement, every chord progression. Soon Willie too was playing, and neighbors began to gather on summer evenings to hear the albino boys make music. Willie possessed an extraordinary musical talent, perfect pitch, and an ability to reproduce any melody after hearing it just once. George had a good ear and steady hands, but Willie was the prodigy. Their music became one of the few sources of joy in a life otherwise marked by hardship and constant vigilance. Harriet Muse worked tirelessly to provide for her growing family. After George and Willie came 3 more children, Dot, Tom, and Ethel, all born with normal pigmentation. The contrast only made George and Willie's condition more striking. Harriet took whatever work she could find, washing clothes for white families, cleaning houses, helping with harvests. Every penny went toward keeping her children fed and clothed. The family lived in a one-room cabin with a dirt floor and no running water. In winter, they huddled around a wood-burning stove for warmth. In summer, the heat was stifling, but they couldn't open the windows during the day because of the boys' sensitivity to light. It was a hard life, but it was their life, and Harriet was determined to keep her family together. The white community of Roanoke County knew about the Muse boys, of course. In a rural area where everyone knew everyone else's business, 2 albino African-American children were impossible to ignore. Some viewed them with curiosity, others with suspicion or outright hostility. There were whispers that they were cursed, that their condition was God's punishment for some imagined sin. Others saw them as oddities of nature, no different from a two-headed calf or a white deer. But there were other eyes watching the Muse boys, eyes that saw not children to be protected, but commodities to be exploited. The exact date remains a mystery that has haunted the Muse family for more than a century. Some say it was 1899, when George was 9 and Willie was 6. Others place it as late as 1914, when the boys would have been young men. But everyone agrees on the essential facts. One day, George and Willie Muse were working in the tobacco fields near their home in Truevine, and the next day they were gone. The most persistent version of the story, the one that has been passed down through generations of Truevine residents, tells of a white man who appeared at the edge of the tobacco field where the boys were working. He was well dressed by rural Virginia standards, wearing a clean suit and a bowler hat despite the heat. In his hand, he carried a paper bag filled with candy, peppermints and hard butterscotch drops that were luxuries the Muse children had rarely tasted. "Come here, boys," he called to George and Willie. "I've got something sweet for you." The man introduced himself as James Herman Shelton, though everyone called him Candy. He claimed to work for a traveling show that was passing through the area, and he spoke to the boys with a kindness they rarely experienced from white men. He asked about their condition, seemed genuinely interested in their musical abilities, and promised them more candy if they would come with him to meet some people who might be able to help them. What happened next depends on who tells the story. Some say the boys willingly followed Shelton, trusting in his promises of sweets and a better life. Others insist they were kidnapped outright, grabbed and thrown into a wagon when they approached to claim their candy. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a gradual seduction that became abduction once the boys were far enough from home to cry for help. What we know for certain is that when the sun set on that fateful day, George and Willie Muse were not in their mother's cabin. Harriet had worked late in the fields herself, and when she returned home expecting to find her boys waiting for supper, she found only empty chairs and a silence that seemed to echo with wrongness. At first she wasn't overly concerned. The boys sometimes wandered farther than they should, lost in their own world of games and music. She called their names into the gathering darkness, her voice carrying across the tobacco fields and into the woods beyond. When there was no answer, she enlisted the help of neighbors. Soon a dozen adults were searching by lantern light, calling for George and Willie, following every path they might have taken. As the hours passed and dawn approached with no sign of the boys, Harriet Muse felt the first cold fingers of true fear closing around her heart. She knew with the instinct of a mother that something terrible had happened. Her sons would never have stayed away all night of their own accord. They were too young, too vulnerable, too dependent on her protection. But when Harriet went to the local sheriff to report her sons missing, she encountered the crushing reality of her place in the social hierarchy of Jim Crow, Virginia. She was a black woman, a sharecropper with no money and no political influence, reporting the disappearance of 2 children that many in the community had always viewed as freaks of nature. The sheriff listened to her story with barely concealed impatience, made a few perfunctory notes and essentially dismissed her concerns. "Boys that age," he told her, "they run off sometimes. Probably just scared about something. They'll come home when they get hungry enough." But Harriet knew better. She knew her sons, knew their routines, knew their fears. George and Willie had never spent a night away from home in their lives. They were too frightened of the world beyond Truevine, too aware of their vulnerability. Something had taken them, and she suspected she knew what. Stories had circulated for years about men who came through rural communities looking for human curiosities. The traveling circus industry was booming in post-Civil War America, and audiences had an insatiable appetite for freaks, people whose physical differences could be packaged as entertainment. Albino African Americans were particularly prized because they combined racial otherness with the exotic appeal of their unusual appearance. Harriet began her own investigation, questioning everyone in the community about strangers they might have seen, unfamiliar wagons or carriages, anything that might provide a clue to her son's whereabouts. Slowly, the story emerged. Yes, several people had seen a well-dressed white man near the tobacco fields around the time the boys disappeared. Yes, he had been asking questions about the Muse children specifically. No one had thought to question his presence or his motives until it was too late. The man who had taken her sons was James Herman Candy Shelton, a small-time circus promoter and talent scout who specialized in acquiring human oddities for the sideshow circuit. Shelton operated in the gray areas of the law, using a combination of deception, coercion, and outright kidnapping to stock his shows with the exotic performers that audiences craved. Shelton understood that in the American South of the early 1900s, 2 albino black children had essentially no legal protection. Their mother was a sharecropper, with no resources to pursue them across state lines. Local law enforcement had no interest in investigating the disappearance of children they viewed as social anomalies. And the federal government, still rebuilding from the Civil War and focused on westward expansion, had neither the infrastructure nor the inclination to pursue kidnappers who preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. For Shelton, George and Willie Muse represented a potential goldmine. Their striking appearance, combined with their musical abilities, made them perfect for the sideshow circuit. All he needed was to transport them far enough from Virginia that they could never find their way home, and then begin the process of transforming them from children into commodities. As Harriet Muse continued her desperate search, asking every traveler and merchant who passed through Truevine if they had seen her boys, James Shelton was already at work erasing George and Willie's identities. He told them their mother was dead, that they had no family, that he was their only protection in a hostile world. He began the psychological manipulation that would define their existence for the next quarter century. The boys, meanwhile, found themselves in a nightmare they could never have imagined. Torn from the only home they had ever known, separated from the mother who had protected them since birth, they clung to each other as their entire world collapsed around them. George, true to his protective nature, tried to shield Willie from the worst of their circumstances, but he was just a child himself, powerless against the machinery of exploitation that had swallowed them whole, and so began one of the most shameful chapters in American entertainment history, the transformation of 2 vulnerable children into Echo and Eco, the supposed ambassadors from another planet, whose humanity would be systematically stripped away in service of a nation's appetite for spectacle. In the first years after their abduction, George and Willie Muse existed in a twilight world between childhood and commodity. James Shelton, their captor and self-appointed manager, began the careful process of erasing their identities and replacing them with profitable fiction. The boys who had once picked tobacco in the Virginia sun were about to become Eastman's Monkey Men, their first step on a journey into dehumanization. The America of the early 1900s was hungry for entertainment. This was the age before radio and television, when traveling shows provided one of the few diversions available to working-class families. The circus had evolved beyond simple animal acts and acrobats to include what were euphemistically called human curiosities and people with physical differences who were displayed like living museums pieces. The sideshow industry operated on a simple principle. The more exotic and removed from normal human experience a performer appeared, the more money audiences would pay to see them. This created a perverse incentive for promoters to acquire and display people with disabilities, genetic conditions, and physical anomalies. The humanity of these performers was systematically stripped away, replaced with elaborate backstories that emphasized their otherness. George and Willie's first manager after Shelton was a man named Charles Eastman, who operated a string of dime museums and traveling sideshows throughout the southeastern United States. Eastman took one look at the albino brothers and saw dollar signs. Their pale skin and light hair, so striking against their African features, made them perfect for the racial fears and fantasies that drove much of the sideshow trade. Under Eastman's management, the boys were given their first stage names, Eastman's Monkey Men. The title was designed to appeal to the racist pseudoscience of the era, which portrayed African Americans as evolutionary links between humans and apes. By adding albinism to the mix, Eastman could present George and Willie as even more exotic, evolutionary anomalies that existed outside the normal categories of human classification. The brothers were forced to perform in ways designed to emphasize their supposed primitiveness. They were dressed in animal skins and feathers, their hair teased into wild configurations, their faces painted with theatrical makeup that exaggerated their features. They were required to grunt and growl instead of speaking, to eat raw meat in front of audiences, and to behave in ways that reinforced the fiction that they were something less than human. The psychological impact of this treatment on two young boys cannot be overstated. George and Willie had been raised by a loving mother who, despite their family's poverty and the challenges posed by their condition, had always treated them as beloved children. Now they were told daily that they were freaks, monsters, evolutionary throwbacks. They were forbidden from speaking about their real family or their life in Virginia. When they cried for their mother, they were beaten and told she was dead. The living conditions for sideshow performers were appalling. George and Willie were housed in cramped, unsanitary quarters, often sharing space with the show's animals. They were fed the cheapest possible food and given only the most basic medical care. Their fair skin, so vulnerable to sunlight, was constantly burned and blistered as they were forced to perform outdoors in all weather conditions. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of their treatment was the deliberate isolation from normal human contact. The boys were discouraged from forming friendships with other performers and were constantly reminded that they were different, that they didn't belong in normal society. This psychological manipulation was designed to make them dependent on their handlers and less likely to attempt escape. Through it all, George continued to protect Willie as best he could. The older brother took the worst punishments, shielded his younger sibling from the most degrading aspects of their performances, and tried to preserve some sense of dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. Willie, for his part, retreated into music, finding in melody and rhythm a refuge from the horror of his daily existence. It was music that inadvertently changed their trajectory in the sideshow world. During a performance in 1915, when the boys were being displayed as Ethiopian Monkey Men under new management, a promoter handed them a banjo and ukulele as props, expecting them to hold the instruments while grunting and posturing for the crowd. Instead, Willie began to play. The effect was electrifying. The audience, which had come expecting to see primitive spectacle, was suddenly confronted with the undeniable humanity of these two young men. Willie's musical gift was extraordinary. He could reproduce any melody after hearing it once, improvise complex variations, and play with a sensitivity that moved even the most callous observers. George, while less gifted, was a competent musician who provided harmony and rhythm for his brother's improvisations. The promoters quickly realized they had something special. Musical freaks were more valuable than simple curiosities because they could provide extended entertainment rather than brief spectacle. The brothers' performances were restructured around their musical abilities, though always within the context of their supposed otherworldliness. By 1917, George and Willie had passed through the hands of several different managers, each of whom refined their presentation and increased their market value. They had been the ministers from Dahomey, the wild men from Borneo, and dozens of other exotic identities. But it was their return to James Shelton's management that would mark the beginning of their most successful and most dehumanizing period. Shelton had spent the intervening years building connections in the circus world, and he now had access to larger venues and more sophisticated promotional machinery. He looked at George and Willie, now in their mid-20s and accomplished musicians, and conceived their most famous incarnation, Echo and Eco, the ambassadors from Mars. The Mars narrative was brilliant in its outrageousness. Shelton claimed the brothers had been discovered in the wreckage of a spacecraft that had crashed in the Mojave Desert. They were the sole survivors of an advanced Martian civilization, he explained, which accounted for their unusual appearance and their otherworldly musical abilities. The story was absurd, but it captured the imagination of audiences in an era fascinated by the possibilities of space travel and extraterrestrial life. Shelton invested in elaborate costumes for the brothers, flowing robes decorated with stars and moons, tall pointed hats that made them appear even more alien, and props that reinforced their supposed Martian origins. Their hair was styled into dramatic spikes that jutted out from their heads, and their performances were surrounded by theatrical effects designed to create an otherworldly atmosphere. The success was immediate and spectacular. Echo and Eco became one of the most popular acts on the sideshow circuit, drawing crowds wherever they appeared. Newspapers wrote breathless accounts of their supposed origins, and their images appeared on postcards and promotional materials distributed across the country. They were no longer just local curiosities. They had become national celebrities, but celebrity for George and Willie Muse meant only a more elaborate form of captivity. Their success made them more valuable to their captors, but it also made escape more difficult. They were constantly watched, their movements restricted, their contact with the outside world carefully controlled. They had become prisoners of their own fame, trapped in identities that bore no resemblance to their true selves. The brothers developed coping mechanisms to survive their circumstances. They created a private language of glances and gestures that allowed them to communicate without their handlers understanding. They found moments of genuine connection with sympathetic performers and staff members who saw through their manufactured personas to the frightened, homesick young men beneath. And they never stopped hoping that somehow, someday, they would find their way back to the tobacco fields of Virginia and the mother they had never forgotten. What they could not know was that hundreds of miles away, in a small house in Roanoke, Harriet Muse had never stopped searching for her sons. She had spent nearly 2 decades following every lead, questioning every traveler, and praying for their safe return. And in 1927, her prayers would finally be answered in the most dramatic way possible, while George and Willie Muse were being transformed into ambassadors from Mars, their mother. Harriet was waging a quiet but determined campaign to find them. For nearly 3 decades, she never gave up hope that her sons were alive and that she would somehow bring them home. Her story is one of extraordinary persistence in the face of a system designed to make people like her invisible and powerless. After the initial dismissive response from local law enforcement, Harriet Muse understood that she would find no help from official channels. In the Jim Crow South, a black woman's word carried no weight against white authority, and the disappearance of 2 children that many viewed as curiosities of nature was not considered a priority. If she was going to find George and Willie, she would have to do it herself. Harriet began by questioning everyone who traveled through the Truevine area. Merchants, peddlers, migrant workers, traveling preachers, anyone who might have seen her sons or heard rumors about their whereabouts. She offered what little money she could spare for information and gradually began to piece together fragments of their story. The first breakthrough came when a traveling salesman told her he had seen 2 albino boys performing with a small circus in North Carolina. The description matched George and Willie, but by the time Harriet could arrange to travel there, the show had moved on. This became a recurring pattern. She would receive a lead, follow it as quickly as her limited resources allowed, only to find that her sons had already been taken elsewhere. The traveling circus world was perfect for hiding kidnapped performers. Shows moved constantly, changed names frequently, and operated largely outside the reach of local law enforcement. Performers lived under assumed identities, and their real backgrounds were deliberately obscured by elaborate fictional narratives. For someone like Harriet, with no money for extensive travel and no official authority to demand information, tracking her sons was like chasing shadows. But Harriet Muse possessed something that her sons' captors had underestimated: an iron will and an unshakable faith that God would eventually reunite her family. She took whatever work she could find to support herself and her remaining children while continuing her search. She cleaned houses for white families in Roanoke, washed laundry, and took in sewing, saving every penny she could toward the day when she might need to travel to retrieve her sons. Around 1917, Harriet remarried a man named Cabell Muse, who gave her his name and helped support the family. Cabell was a complex figure, sometimes supportive of Harriet's quest, sometimes dismissive of what he saw as an impossible dream. But the marriage provided some stability and allowed Harriet to move from the isolated community of Truevine into the larger town of Roanoke, where she had access to more information and resources. As the years passed, Harriet began to receive more concrete information about her sons. Travelers who had attended circuses and sideshows would sometimes mention seeing two albino black men who played music and claimed to be from Mars. These accounts were fragmentary and often confused, but they convinced Harriet that George and Willie were still alive and still being displayed as curiosities. The breakthrough that would eventually lead to their reunion came through an unexpected source: the African American press. Black newspapers, operating largely separate from white media, occasionally carried stories about the exploitation of black performers in traveling shows. In the early 1920s, Harriet encountered an article that described two musical performers known as Echo and Eco, who were being displayed as Martian ambassadors with the Ringling Brothers Circus. The article included enough physical description and biographical details for Harriet to become convinced that these were her sons. The performers were described as albino black men in their 20s who played multiple instruments and had been with various circuses for decades. Most convincingly, the article mentioned that they sometimes seemed sad or withdrawn despite their supposed alien origins, and that other performers reported hearing them speak in ways that suggested they were not the exotic beings they were presented as. Armed with this information, Harriet began following the Ringling Brothers' tour schedule, published in newspapers and promotional materials. She learned when the circus would be in various cities, how long they would stay, and what acts would be featured. For the first time since her son's disappearance, she had specific, actionable information about their whereabouts, but translating this knowledge into action proved difficult. Harriet had no money for long-distance travel, and even if she could reach a city where the circus was performing, she had no guarantee of being able to access her sons or convince anyone in authority that they were being held against their will. The circus world was notoriously closed to outsiders, and the legal system offered no protections for people in her situation. Throughout this period, Harriet was sustained by her faith and by the support of the African American community in Roanoke. Her church congregation prayed for her son's return and sometimes contributed small amounts of money toward her search efforts. Neighbors who had known George and Willie as children never stopped believing in Harriet's cause, and their encouragement helped her maintain hope during the darkest periods. Harriet also drew strength from the conviction that her sons had never forgotten her. She refused to believe the story that they had been told she was dead, trusting instead in the bond between mother and children that she knew could not be broken by distance or time. In quiet moments, she would sometimes feel a spiritual connection to George and Willie, a sense that they were thinking of her and hoping for rescue just as fervently as she was searching for them. The years of separation had changed Harriet profoundly. The young mother who had lost her sons in the tobacco fields had become a determined, resourceful woman who had learned to navigate hostile systems and refused to accept defeat. She had educated herself about the legal system, the entertainment industry, and the network of people and organizations that might be able to help her cause. She had transformed her grief into purpose and her powerlessness into quiet strength. By 1927, Harriet had been searching for her sons for nearly 3 decades. She was in her 50s. Her hair was gray and her face bore the lines of years of worry and hard work. But her determination had never wavered, and her faith in eventual reunion had only grown stronger. She had no way of knowing that the moment she had prayed for was finally at hand, that her sons were about to return to Virginia, and that the 3 of them were about to create one of the most dramatic reunions in the history of American entertainment. On October 14, 1927, the Ringling Brothers Circus arrived in Roanoke for a 3-day engagement. Harriet Muse, following a schedule she had memorized months in advance, prepared to attend the performance. She had attended circus shows before when they came through the area, always hoping to catch a glimpse of her sons, always leaving disappointed. But this time felt different. This time, she had a dream that had shown her exactly what was about to happen. Chapter 5. The Reunion. October 14, 1927, dawned crisp and clear in Roanoke, Virginia. The Ringling Brothers Circus had arrived in town the night before, and by morning, the distinctive smells of sawdust, animals, and cotton candy were drifting through the streets. For most residents, it was simply another exciting break from the routine of small-town life. For Harriet Muse, it was the culmination of 28 years of searching, hoping, and refusing to give up. Harriet had experienced what she later described as a prophetic dream 3 nights before the circus arrived. In the dream, she saw herself in a crowded tent, watching 2 men on stage who were playing music. As she watched, one of the men looked directly at her, and she recognized the eyes of her son George, now grown into a man, but still bearing the unmistakable features she remembered from his childhood. The dream was so vivid, so convincing, that Harriet knew with absolute certainty that her sons were coming home. She spent the morning of October 14th preparing for what she somehow knew would be the most important day of her life. She put on her best dress, the one she wore to church on Sundays, and carefully arranged her hair. She wanted her sons to see her at her best when the moment of recognition came. At 57, Harriet was no longer the young mother who had lost her children in the tobacco fields, but she was still the woman who had never stopped loving them, never stopped believing in their return. The circus was performing in a large tent on the outskirts of Roanoke, and by afternoon, hundreds of people had gathered for the matinee performance. Harriet purchased a ticket with money she had been saving for months and made her way into the crowded tent. She found a seat near the back, where she could see the entire performance area but remain relatively inconspicuous. The show began with the usual parade of acts, acrobats, clowns, trained animals, and daredevil performers. Harriet watched politely but with growing anticipation. She knew that the sideshow acts typically appeared later in the program, and she forced herself to be patient as the afternoon wore on. Around her, children squealed with delight at the spectacle, and adults laughed and applauded. But Harriet remained focused on the moment she knew was coming. Finally, near the end of the performance, the ringmaster's voice boomed through the tent. "Ladies and gentlemen, direct from the planet Mars, the most extraordinary beings ever to walk the Earth, Echo and Eco, the ambassadors from Mars." The crowd stirred with excitement as 2 figures took the stage. Harriet's heart nearly stopped. Despite their outlandish costumes, flowing robes decorated with celestial symbols, elaborate headdresses that made their pale hair spike out in all directions, and theatrical makeup that was designed to make them appear otherworldly, she recognized her sons immediately. George, now 37 years old, had grown tall and lean, but he still carried himself with the protective posture she remembered from his childhood. Willie, 34, had the same gentle expression and musical grace that had enchanted their neighbors in Truevine decades earlier. The brothers began to play, launching into It's a Long Way to Tipperary, a song that had become popular during World War I. Their musical skills had clearly developed tremendously during their years in captivity. Willie's banjo work was intricate and expressive, while George provided steady rhythm and harmony on his guitar. Despite the circumstances of their performance, their music retained a haunting beauty that moved even the most callous observers. As the song continued, George began scanning the crowd with the same protective awareness he had shown as a child. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps it was the same spiritual connection that had guided Harriet to this moment, but his eyes found her in the back of the tent. For a moment, time seemed suspended as mother and son looked at each other across 3 decades of separation. George's fingers nearly stumbled on the guitar strings. He leaned toward Willie and whispered urgently in his ear. Willie looked up from his banjo, followed his brother's gaze, and saw their mother for the first time since childhood. The recognition was instant and mutual. "There's our dear old mother," George said, his voice carrying clearly through the tent despite the ongoing music. "Look, Willie, she is not dead." The brothers stopped playing mid-song and stepped down from the performance platform. The crowd, confused by this departure from the scripted show, began to murmur and shift restlessly. But George and Willie had eyes only for the small, grey-haired woman making her way through the crowd toward them. Harriet Muse pushed through the gathered spectators with a determination that brooked no obstacles. People stepped aside, sensing the intensity of her purpose, even if they didn't understand what was happening. When she reached her sons, she threw her arms around them both, and for a moment the 3 of them stood locked in an embrace that seemed to shut out the rest of the world. "My boys," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My beautiful boys? I knew you were alive. I knew God would bring you back to me." George and Willie, both crying now, held their mother tightly. "Mama," George kept repeating. "Mama, you're not dead." "They told us you were dead." The reunion lasted only a few moments before James Shelton, their manager, pushed through the crowd to see what had disrupted his show. When he saw Harriet embracing his star performers, his face flushed with anger and alarm. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "Who is this woman? Get away from my boys." Harriet turned to face Shelton with a composure that surprised even herself. "These are my sons," she said firmly. "George and Willie Muse. I am their mother, and I've been looking for them for 28 years. Shelton laughed dismissively. "Lady, you're confused. These are Echo and Eco, ambassadors from Mars. They don't have a mother. They're not even from Earth. Now get away from them, before I call the police." "Call the police," Harriet replied calmly. "I want to talk to them too." The confrontation was drawing attention from other circus personnel and spectators. A crowd had gathered around the unusual scene, and someone had indeed summoned the local police. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived to sort out what appeared to be a dispute over the circus performers. Shelton immediately began explaining to the police that this woman was obviously deranged, that she was disrupting the show and harassing his performers. He showed them the contracts and documentation that established his legal ownership of Echo and Eco, and demanded that they remove the troublemaker from the premises. But when the officers turned to question Harriet, they encountered a woman who was prepared for this moment in ways that Shelton could never have anticipated. She had spent years learning about the legal system, understanding her rights and preparing for the day when she might need to prove her relationship to her sons. She had brought documentation with her, church records showing the boys' births, testimony from neighbors who remembered them as children, and her own detailed knowledge of their early lives that no one else could possess. More importantly, she had George and Willie themselves. Despite nearly 3 decades of psychological manipulation designed to make them forget their origins, the brothers had never lost their memories of childhood in Truevine. They remembered their mother's face, their siblings' names, the layout of their cabin, the taste of her cooking, and hundreds of other details that proved their true identities beyond any doubt. The police found themselves in an unprecedented situation. On one hand, they had a circus manager with what appeared to be legal documentation, establishing his right to the performers. On the other hand, they had a woman whose story was supported by the performers themselves and by evidence that seemed to confirm her claims. As the crowd grew larger and the situation more complex, the officers made a decision that would change the course of 3 lives forever. They determined that regardless of what contracts Shelton might possess, George and Willie Muse were free men who had the right to choose their own destiny. If they wanted to go with this woman who claimed to be their mother, and if they confirmed her story, then no one had the legal authority to stop them. "Do you know this woman?" one of the officers asked George directly. "Yes, sir," George replied, his voice shaking with emotion. "This is our mother, Harriet Muse. We've been trying to get home to her for 28 years. That was enough for the police. They informed Shelton that his performers were free to leave if they chose to do so, and that any legal disputes over contracts would have to be settled in court. For the moment, George and Willie Muse were going home with their mother. As the 3 of them walked away from the circus tent together, Harriet felt a peace she had not known since 1899. Her faith had been vindicated, her determination rewarded, and her family restored. The boys who had disappeared from the tobacco fields as children were returning as grown men, scarred by their experiences, but unbroken in spirit. But even as they celebrated their reunion, all 3 knew that their struggles were far from over. Shelton would not give up easily, and the legal battle for George and Willie's freedom was just beginning. The reunion of the Muse family should have been the end of their story, but in reality, it was only the beginning of a new and different kind of struggle. James Shelton had invested too much time, money, and effort in Echo and Eco to simply let them walk away. Within days of the dramatic scene at the Roanoke Circus, he had filed lawsuits in multiple jurisdictions, claiming that George and Willie were contractually bound to him and that their departure constituted theft of valuable property. The legal battle that followed was unprecedented in American entertainment history. Never before had the courts been asked to rule on whether human beings could be owned through performance contracts, whether kidnapping victims could be held legally responsible for honoring agreements made under duress, and whether a black mother in the Jim Crow South had the right to reclaim her adult sons from white managers who claimed to own them. Shelton's legal strategy was sophisticated and ruthless. He argued that regardless of how George and Willie had originally come into his possession, they had been performing under valid contracts for years. He produced documentation showing payments made to the brothers, agreements signed with their marks or signatures, and testimony from circus personnel who swore that the performers had never expressed any desire to leave their employment. More insidiously, Shelton's lawyers argued that George and Willie were not competent to make decisions about their own lives. They claimed that the brothers' albinism and their years of specialized training as sideshow performers had left them unable to function in normal society. In court documents, they described the brothers as mentally deficient, childlike in their understanding, and dependent on their manager for basic survival needs. This strategy played into the worst prejudices of the era. In the 1920s, people with disabilities were routinely declared incompetent and placed under the legal guardianship of institutions or individuals who profited from their condition. The combination of racial prejudice and disability discrimination created a legal environment where George and Willie's autonomy could be easily challenged. Harriet Muse faced these challenges with the same determination she had shown during her decades-long search for her sons. She understood that she was fighting not just for George and Willie's freedom, but for the principle that human beings could not be owned, regardless of their race or condition. She also knew that as a black woman in the segregated South she would need all the help she could get. Fortunately, the dramatic circumstances of the reunion had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The story of the albino brothers and their mother had been picked up by newspapers across the country, and public sympathy was largely on the Muse family's side. Several prominent lawyers offered to represent them pro bono, recognizing both the legal significance of the case and its potential for positive publicity. The legal proceedings revealed the full extent of the exploitation that George and Willie had endured. Financial records showed that while Echo and Eco had earned enormous sums for their various managers over the years, sometimes as much as $32,000 per day, an astronomical amount for the 1920s, the brothers themselves had received only minimal compensation. Most of their earnings had gone to their handlers, with George and Willie receiving just enough to cover their basic needs. More damning still were the testimonies of former circus employees who described the conditions under which the brothers had lived and worked. They told of physical abuse, psychological manipulation, and deliberate isolation designed to keep the performers dependent on their managers. Several witnesses confirmed that George and Willie had frequently asked about their mother and expressed desire to return home, only to be told that she was dead and that they had no family. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court proved to be a turning point in the case. When examined by independent medical professionals, George and Willie were found to be fully competent adults who understood the nature of their situation and were capable of making their own decisions. The examining physicians noted that while the brothers had some educational deficits resulting from their lack of formal schooling, they showed no signs of intellectual disability or mental incompetence. The brothers' own testimony was perhaps the most powerful evidence in their favor. Speaking publicly for the first time about their experiences, George and Willie described their kidnapping, their years of captivity, and their constant longing for home. Their accounts were detailed, consistent, and deeply moving. Willie, in particular, proved to be an articulate spokesman who could describe not only the facts of their exploitation, but also its emotional impact. "They told us our mama was dead," Willie testified. "They said we had no family, that Mr. Shelton was all the family we would ever have. But we never believed it. We knew in our hearts that our mama was alive, and we prayed every day that we would see her again." As the legal battle continued, public support for the Muse family grew stronger. African American newspapers, in particular, covered the story extensively, recognizing it as a symbol of broader struggles for civil rights and human dignity. The case became a cause célèbre in black communities across the country, with churches and civic organizations raising money for the family's legal expenses. The turning point came when the court ruled that, regardless of what contracts might exist, they could not be enforced because they had been obtained through fraud and duress. The judge noted that even if George and Willie had voluntarily agreed to perform initially, which the evidence suggested they had not, they could not be held indefinitely against their will by documents signed when they were minors and under extreme psychological pressure. But Shelton and the circus industry were not ready to concede defeat. They appealed the decision and launched a public relations campaign designed to portray George and Willie as ungrateful performers who were abandoning their obligations. They argued that the brothers had been given opportunities and experiences they never could have had otherwise, and that their success as Echo and Eco proved that their treatment had been beneficial rather than exploitative. This argument revealed the fundamental disconnect between the entertainment industry's view of disability and the emerging understanding of human rights. From the industry's perspective, George and Willie should have been grateful for the chance to earn money from their condition rather than living in poverty in rural Virginia. The idea that they might prefer freedom and dignity to fame and financial success was incomprehensible to managers who saw disability only as a commodity to be exploited. The final resolution came in 1928, when the Virginia Supreme Court upheld the lower court's decision and ruled that George and Willie Muse were free to determine their own futures. The court's decision was narrow, focusing on the specific circumstances of their case, rather than establishing broad precedents about performer rights or disability exploitation. But for the Muse family, it represented complete vindication. The legal victory came with a price, however. The circus industry, while forced to acknowledge the brothers' freedom, was not required to compensate them for their years of exploitation. The vast sums that Echo and Eco had earned remained in the hands of their former managers, and George and Willie received no back pay or damages for their decades of captivity. More surprisingly, the brothers chose to continue performing. The entertainment industry was the only world they had known for most of their adult lives, and their musical abilities remained their most marketable skills. But now they performed on their own terms, with contracts that guaranteed them fair compensation, regular visits home, and the right to leave whenever they chose. Under these new arrangements, George and Willie returned to the stage as Echo and Eco, but the dynamic of their performances had changed completely. They were no longer prisoners displaying their otherness for the amusement of others. They were professional entertainers using their unique talents to make a living. The difference was subtle but profound, representing the transformation from exploitation to self-determination. The years following their legal victory marked a new chapter in the lives of George and Willie Muse, one defined by choices rather than captivity. For the first time since childhood, they could decide where to go, what to do, and how to live. Yet the transition from exploitation to freedom proved more complex than anyone had anticipated, revealing the lasting psychological and practical impacts of their decades in captivity. Initially, George and Willie attempted to retire from show business entirely. They returned to Truevine with their mother, hoping to reclaim the simple rural life they had lost as children. Harriet had used the money from her legal settlement and her years of careful saving to purchase a small farm, and for a brief period, it seemed as though the brothers might find peace in the tobacco fields where their ordeal had begun. But the intervening years had changed them too much for a complete return to their origins. George and Willie were now men in their late 30s and mid-30s, respectively, who had spent their entire adult lives as professional performers. They had traveled the world, lived in cities, and developed skills and perspectives that didn't easily translate to rural farm life. Moreover, their albinism made outdoor agricultural work physically punishing in ways that their childhood memories had perhaps romanticized. More challenging still was the psychological adjustment to freedom. After decades of having every decision made for them, George and Willie struggled with the overwhelming nature of autonomy. Simple choices, what to eat, where to go, how to spend their time, could trigger anxiety and uncertainty. They had been conditioned to look to authority figures for guidance, and the absence of such structure, even though it represented liberation, initially felt more frightening than comforting. The brothers also discovered that their fame as Echo and Eco had made genuine privacy impossible. Curious visitors constantly appeared at their mother's farm, hoping to catch a glimpse of the former ambassadors from Mars. Some came with innocent curiosity, others with exploitative intentions. Local entrepreneurs tried to convince them to make appearances or endorse products. The attention, while less degrading than their circus days, was still intrusive and uncomfortable. Within a year of their legal victory, George and Willie made the difficult decision to return to professional entertainment. However, this time, they insisted on contracts that guaranteed their fundamental rights: fair compensation, regular time off, the ability to visit their family, and most importantly, the right to quit whenever they chose. They also demanded that their performances emphasize their musical abilities rather than their physical appearance. Though they agreed to continue using the Echo and Eco personas, that audiences expected. The new arrangement represented a compromise between practical necessity and personal dignity. The brothers needed to earn a living, and entertainment was their most developed skill. The public wanted to see Eco and Eco, and George and Willie were willing to provide that experience as long as they retained control over their lives and working conditions. Under these terms, they embarked on what would become their most successful and artistically satisfying period as performers. No longer forced to engage in degrading behavior or maintain the fiction of their alien origins, they could focus on their genuine talents as musicians. Their performances became more nuanced and sophisticated, incorporating elements of blues, folk, and popular music that reflected their authentic experiences rather than manufactured exoticism. The brothers toured extensively throughout the late 1920s and 1930s, traveling not just across the United States, but internationally as well. They performed in Europe, where audiences were fascinated by their story and their music. In London, they stayed at the prestigious Strand Palace Hotel, where Willie developed his lifelong habit of calling out, "Housekeeping," in an exaggerated English accent, whenever he heard a doorbell, a quirky reminder of their more dignified treatment. Abroad, their international success was particularly meaningful because it offered them recognition as artists rather than mere curiosities. European audiences, while certainly intrigued by their appearance, were more focused on their musical abilities and less invested in the racial dynamics that had shaped their American reception. For perhaps the first time in their adult lives, George and Willie experienced applause that felt like appreciation rather than exploitation. Back home in Virginia, they used their earnings to improve their family's circumstances significantly. They purchased a comfortable house in Roanoke for their mother, ensuring that Harriet could live out her remaining years in security and dignity. They also helped support their siblings and contributed to the broader Truevine community, becoming local success stories who had overcome incredible adversity. The brothers' relationship with their mother during this period was both healing and complicated. Harriet was overjoyed to have her sons back, but the men who returned were not the children she had lost. George and Willie had been shaped by experiences she could barely imagine, and they sometimes struggled to connect with the woman who had never stopped loving them, but who couldn't fully understand what they had endured. There were also practical challenges. The brothers had developed habits and preferences during their years on the road that didn't always align with their mother's expectations or the social norms of rural Virginia. They had learned to navigate sophisticated urban environments, to interact with people from diverse backgrounds, and to function in the complex world of professional entertainment. Returning to the insularity of small-town life required significant adjustment for all concerned. Perhaps most poignantly, George and Willie had to confront the reality that they could never fully reclaim their lost childhoods or the family relationships that had been severed by their abduction. Their siblings had grown up without them. Their mother had aged through decades of worry and grief, and the community they remembered had changed in fundamental ways. The reunion, while joyful, could not erase the years of separation or restore what had been lost. Despite these challenges, the 1930s represented the happiest period of the brothers' adult lives. They had achieved a balance between professional success and personal freedom that had once seemed impossible. They could perform on their own terms, earn a good living, and maintain close ties with their family. They had transformed themselves from victims into survivors, from commodities into human beings with agency and dignity. The onset of World War II brought changes to the entertainment industry that would eventually lead to George and Willie's retirement from show business. The war effort redirected public attention and resources away from civilian entertainment and the sideshow industry, already in decline due to changing social attitudes and the rise of other forms of media, began to contract significantly. By the mid-1940s, the brothers were performing less frequently and spending more time at home in Virginia. They had saved enough money to live comfortably without the need for constant touring, and they were increasingly interested in a quieter, more private life. The death of their mother, Harriet, in 1942 marked the end of an era and influenced their decision to step back from public life. Harriet Muse died peacefully at the age of 72, surrounded by the children she had fought so hard to protect and reunite. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people from throughout the region, testimony to the respect and affection she had earned through her decades of determination and grace. For George and Willie, her death represented both profound loss and a kind of completion. The woman who had never given up hope for their return had lived to see them safe, successful, and free. The post-war years brought George and Willie Muse into the final phase of their extraordinary lives, a period marked by quiet dignity, genuine privacy, and the simple pleasures that had been denied to them for so long. After retiring from show business in the mid-1950s, the brothers settled permanently in Roanoke, where they could live as ordinary citizens rather than exotic curiosities. The house they shared was modest but comfortable, located in a predominantly African-American neighborhood where their presence, while noteworthy, was not sensational. Their neighbors knew their history, of course. The story of Echo and Eco was too remarkable to remain secret, but they respected the brothers' desire for normalcy and privacy. George and Willie became familiar figures in the community, known for their kindness, their musical talents, and their willingness to help others when needed. Retirement allowed them to pursue interests and relationships that had been impossible during their performing years. They became regular attendees at local churches, where their musical abilities were welcomed but not exploited. They gardened, read, listened to radio programs, and engaged in the countless small activities that make up normal daily life. For men who had spent decades as public spectacles, these ordinary pleasures represented profound liberation. The brothers maintained different personalities and interests that had been obscured by their public personas. George remained the protector, the more serious and cautious of the two, always looking out for Willie's welfare and serving as the practical manager of their household affairs. Willie was more outgoing and playful, retaining the musical curiosity and gentle humor that had sustained him through the darkest periods of their captivity. Willie's musical talents continued to evolve even in retirement. He collected instruments, learned new songs from radio broadcasts, and occasionally gave informal performances for friends and neighbors. His ability to reproduce any melody after a single hearing remained extraordinary, and local musicians would sometimes visit just to watch him work out complex arrangements by ear. These sessions were collaborative rather than exploitative, representing the kind of genuine artistic exchange that had been impossible during his circus years. George found satisfaction in more mundane pursuits. He became an excellent cook, learning to prepare the southern dishes that had been denied to them during their years on the road. He maintained their house and garden with meticulous care, perhaps finding in these domestic responsibilities a sense of control and stability that had been missing from his earlier life. He also served as Willie's primary caregiver, monitoring his brother's health and managing their finances with the prudence of someone who had learned never to take security for granted. The brothers lived frugally, not from necessity but from choice. Their years of exploitation had taught them the value of independence, and they were determined never again to be vulnerable to the whims of others. They had saved their performance earnings carefully, invested in property and conservative securities, and maintained a lifestyle that ensured their continued autonomy, regardless of changing circumstances. As the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 1950s and 1960s, George and Willie watched with interest, but did not become actively involved. Their own struggle for freedom had been deeply personal rather than political, focused on individual liberation rather than systemic change. However, They understood the connections between their experience and the broader fight for African American rights, and they quietly supported the movement through donations and moral encouragement. The brothers also witnessed significant changes in social attitudes toward disability during their later years. The sideshow industry that had exploited them was dying out, replaced by more enlightened approaches to human differences. While they were gratified by these developments, they remained somewhat wary of public attention, having learned through bitter experience that even well-intentioned interest could become intrusive and problematic. Occasionally, journalists or researchers would seek them out, hoping to document their story for historical purposes. George and Willie were generally cooperative but cautious, willing to share their experiences, but insistent on maintaining control over how their story was told. They had no desire to be portrayed as victims or heroes. They simply wanted their humanity to be recognized and their dignity to be preserved. The passing years brought the inevitable challenges of aging. George's health began to decline in the late 1960s, and Willie took on increasing responsibility for his older brother's care. The reversal of their traditional roles, Willie protecting George rather than the other way around, was difficult for both men, but they adapted with the same resilience that had carried them through earlier trials. George Muse died of heart failure on January 15, 1972, at the age of 82. His death marked the end of one of the most remarkable partnerships in American entertainment history. But more importantly, it represented the peaceful conclusion of a life that had overcome incredible adversity. He died in his own bed, surrounded by people who loved him, having achieved the freedom and dignity that had been denied to him for so many years. Willie's grief at his brother's death was profound and complicated. George had been not only his sibling but his protector, his partner, and his closest friend for more than 8 decades. The loss left Willie feeling unmoored in ways that he struggled to articulate, even to himself. But he was determined to continue living independently, honoring both his brother's memory and their shared commitment to autonomy. Willie Muse lived for nearly 30 more years after George's death, becoming something of a local institution in Roanoke. He maintained his musical interests, his sense of humor, and his connections to the community that had welcomed him home. He never married or had children of his own, but he served as a beloved uncle figure to numerous nieces, nephews, and young neighbors who knew him simply as Mr. Willie. As Willie entered his 90s and then his 100th year, he began to receive recognition as one of the last survivors of America's sideshow era. Historians and students of entertainment history sought him out, and he became more willing to share his experiences with researchers who could help ensure that the story of Eco and Eco would not be forgotten or romanticized. Willie Muse died on April 9, 2001, at the remarkable age of 108. His longevity was extraordinary by any measure, but perhaps even more remarkable was the fact that he had lived to see the complete transformation of American attitudes toward the kind of exploitation he and his brother had endured. The sideshow industry was extinct, disability rights were protected by federal law, and the idea that human beings could be displayed as curiosities had become universally recognized as morally reprehensible. At Willie's funeral, hundreds of people gathered to pay their respects to a man who had lived through more than a century of American history and had personally experienced some of its most shameful and redemptive moments. The service was filled with music, reflecting the gift that had sustained Willie through his darkest hours and brought joy to countless others. Throughout his long life, the story of George and Willie Muse stands as one of the most extraordinary tales of survival, resilience, and ultimate triumph in American history. From their mysterious disappearance in the tobacco fields of Virginia to their dramatic reunion with their mother nearly 3 decades later, their lives encompassed some of the best and worst aspects of the American experience. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our past, about the systematic exploitation of vulnerable people, about the entertainment industry's willingness to profit from human suffering, and about the ways in which racism and ableism combine to create particular forms of cruelty and indifference. The fact that 2 children could be kidnapped, held in captivity for decades, and displayed as alien beings, while legal and social institutions looked the other way, reveals the depths of institutional failure and moral blindness that characterized much of early 20th century America. But their story is also profoundly inspiring, demonstrating the power of love, determination, and faith to overcome seemingly impossible odds. Harriet Muse's refusal to accept her son's disappearance, her decades-long search, and her ultimate success in freeing them represent one of the most remarkable examples of parental devotion in recorded history. Her victory over a system designed to render her powerless stands as a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the possibility of justice even in the most unjust circumstances. The brothers themselves showed extraordinary resilience in maintaining their humanity and their bond with each other, despite systematic attempts to strip away their identity and dignity. Their ability to find meaning and joy in music, to preserve their memories of home and family, and to ultimately reclaim their freedom demonstrates the fundamental indestructibility of the human spirit. Perhaps most importantly, their story reminds us of the countless other people whose experiences of exploitation and abuse have been forgotten or ignored. For every George and Willie Muse who achieved recognition and justice, there were undoubtedly dozens or hundreds of others whose stories remain untold, whose suffering went unacknowledged, and whose humanity was denied without consequence. The entertainment industry's exploitation of people with disabilities continued well into the 20th century, and echoes of these attitudes persist even today in more subtle forms. The story of Echo and Eco serves as a powerful reminder of our responsibility to protect vulnerable people from exploitation and to recognize the full humanity of those who are different from ourselves. Today, the community of Truevine still remembers the Muse brothers, and their story has become part of the local folklore that is passed down from generation to generation. Their experience has been documented in books, articles, and academic studies that ensure their legacy will not be forgotten. Most importantly, their triumph over exploitation and their ultimate achievement of freedom and dignity continue to inspire others who face their own struggles against injustice and discrimination. The boys who disappeared from the Virginia tobacco fields more than a century ago became symbols of both humanity's capacity for cruelty and its potential for redemption. Their story belongs not just to the circus sideshows of the past, but to the ongoing struggle for human rights, dignity, and justice that continues today. In remembering George and Willie Muse, we honor not only their individual courage and resilience, but also the countless other forgotten voices in the litany of the lost, those whose stories remind us of our shared humanity and our responsibility to protect and cherish each other, regardless of our differences. This has been the story of 2 brothers who were stolen from their family as children, transformed into living myths, and ultimately reclaimed their humanity through love, determination, and the unbreakable bonds of family. May their memory serve as both a warning about the dangers of exploitation and a beacon of hope for all those who struggle against injustice. Their story teaches us that no one is truly lost as long as someone refuses to stop looking. No one is beyond redemption as long as love endures. And no system of oppression is so powerful that it cannot be overcome by the combined forces of human dignity, legal justice, and moral courage. The ambassadors from Mars came home, and in coming home, they reminded us all of what it truly means to be human.